going to go ahead and get started. Everyone, thank you for joining us on a Wednesday. We have not done a webinar in quite a while, and so happy to bring this back. And I guess it's certainly hyperbole to say, or not hyperbole to say, that we've had a heck of a year. We've just had a lot of stuff dealing with COVID-19, but today we're going to talk about some of the funding and some of the compliance requirements associated with the funding. Of course, we've had the CARES Act. We had some additional stimulus money last December, and now we have the ARP funding. We also have, on top of that, we have a FEMA declaration that pays for significant portions of the COVID response. And today we've got our presenter, Matt Jadowski from Ernst Young, and he's got a heck of a career in emergency management, Department of Homeland Security, and really compliance with a lot of the federal grant programs, including the CDBG Disaster Relief, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and of course, the Public Assistance Program. So today he's going to talk to us about really making sure that counties are able to document and meet the compliance requirements that are issued by the different agencies. And so Matt has been kind of a long-term partner with the association. He spoke at our Hurricane Summit that we had after 2017, after Hurricane Irma, but really is a go-to person to talk about some of the issues that we have concerns about on de-obligations and of course the compliance requirements. And so with that introduction, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you. If folks have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll either answer them during the presentation or we can just save them to the end. So Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Eric, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Good. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar on Who's on First. What I plan to talk about today is not so much as the particular programs with ARPA, but the different rules and regulations that are going to be applicable to the ARPA. As Eric mentioned, I spent a lot of time I worked for the federal government for 30 years, a variety of senior positions, the last 20 of which I worked at FEMA. I was their chief financial officer, and then I moved to the inspector general's office. So I was responsible for doing the audits, investigations, inspections of a lot of the public assistance dollars that were going out there. So I wasn't responsible for those huge de-obligations several years ago, but nonetheless, I understand how the whole process works and what the auditor. So I'm going to talk a lot about what the audit process is, how you're selected for an audit, the types of nuances to be looking for, and how to prepare for those types of things. So a little bit of, I just want to get into real quick. I just want to talk about the general overview of the rescue plan, but really I want to spend a lot of time, again, talking about the different rules that are going to be applicable to the ARPA that are different from the CARES Act. In some cases, they're very similar to what you're used to dealing with FEMA, 2 CFR Part 200, the Uniform Guidance. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Potentials of commingling dollars and things like that, what some of the pitfalls would be. What are some of the common audit findings? What are the specific rules that you need to be aware of? And then just in general, what the oversight bodies are and what you can expect from when the feds come in looking at how these dollars were spent. So general overview, $1.9 trillion to government aid packages. A significant of that, over $300 billion, is going down to state, local governments, counties, cities, tribes, things like that, for a variety of types of issues. The funds are available, unlike the CRF funds, we had a pretty short fuse, so there is time to spend it by December 31st, 2024. Typically, that would mean that the funds have to be obligated by that date. If it's a long-term construction project, just making sure those things are in place. Treasury will be issuing a lot of these dollars, although there will be dollars going out from the Department of Education for some K-12 programs and some other types of things. So, but Treasury is really going to be the driving force behind overseeing and providing administration over the ARPA funding. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the interim guidance that Treasury has put out. So next page, please. I'm not going to go through this in detail, just gives you some sort of sense of what the distribution of funds is. But, the important thing is that there's $350 billion going out there, and there's much more tighter or more stringent regulations that are going to be applicable to these funds versus the CARE Act funds, and I'll get to that in a minute. But nevertheless, a significant amount of funding is going out to the state and local governments. Next. Okay, so how does the CARES Act versus the American Rescue Plan, what are the differences there? When the CARES Act came out, the Office of Management Budget, the Federal Office of Management Budget said, these are not really grants. So a lot of the provisions in 2 CFR, and for those who don't know what 2 CFR, it's really the uniform guidance that agencies are required to use when they're making grants. It provides information on procurement, the cost principles, the types of things that the recipients of grants must abide by, and also what the various departments use when they're measuring compliance. So a lot of the provisions, the procurement provisions were not there. I'll get into procurement because that's a little bit later, because that seems to be a lot of where the big problems are. The only really provisions that were there was you have to include it in your A133 or single audit. And then the other provision would be that you have to have a set of internal controls. So really, most of the detailed requirements in 2 CFR did not apply. The American Rescue Plan Act does apply. It's considered a federal grant. As a matter of fact, OMB, and I'll talk about them in a minute too, put out some guidance that says that the agencies, departments and agencies providing ARPA money have to follow 2 CFR to the fullest extent practical. So expect those regulations to be applicable. Treasury's just some guidance. I mean, the funding, it's only a couple months old, so certainly don't have a lot of the guidance in place, and we can see some of the guidance and lack of guidance coming out of the CARES Act. It's kind of a work in process. So they put out an interim final rule and some Q's and A's, which I find are very, it's a good start, but I think they need a lot more information about that. It talks about the SAM accounts, the systems for award management. Everybody has to do that. And this also applies to you and your subrecipients, establishing taxpayer IDs, talks about internal controls and single audits for CARES, procurement and ARPA, procurement provisions, cost principles, and pandemic emergency procurement does not apply, meaning, if it's an exigent circumstance, relaxing some of the procurement regulations, that's not going to apply to the ARPA funding. It did for FEMA during the pandemic, but it does not apply here. So next slide, please. Okay, so again, what is 2 CFR? It's the grant funding in the United States, highly regulated in 2 CFR. 2 CFR was issued, I guess, 5, 6, 7 years ago now. Each federal agency had developed their own cost principles. There was a number of circulars that OMB circulated on different rules applicable to higher education, state and local governments, hospitals, some of those types of things. There was an effort made to consolidate all of those in what they call 2 CFR, the common rule or the uniform guidance. And it provides administrative requirements, cost principles, audit requirements for the awards. If you don't know what it is and you expect to get ARPA money, you need to understand what some of those rules are applicable, because when the auditors come in, the first thing they look at beyond the specific agency guidance for compliance is going to be 2 CFR. And in most cases, the audit findings I'll talk about later are really result from non-compliance with 2 CFR provisions. And again, it's supposed to streamline, so every agency doesn't have separate procurement rules. It reduces administrative burden, improves outcomes. But I'll talk more about 2 CFR in a minute. Next slide, please. There's cost principles. This is significant. The cost principles, there's certain things that are eligible that are not eligible. You need to understand what they are. For example, if you get a federal award, you can't use any of those federal dollars for lobbying. It's something they're going to look for. There's property standards. If you're buying things under using federal dollars, there's property disposition, procurement. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about procurement. Because that's typically where most folks have issues not understanding what the nuances are of the federal procurement regulations, how they apply to non-federal entities other than states, record retention, remedies for noncompliance. I'm going to talk about the audit requirements. I think most of you have probably experienced a single audit before, the A133 audit, as used to be known. And this will just add to that. And then what will happen if these regulations are not complied with? And again, I think a lot of you have either heard about or experienced de-obligations or clawbacks in the federal government. So a lot of these things I'm going to talk about today are designed to create the awareness that you understand what the rules are, the types of things you're going to look at. But again, most importantly, at the end of the process, that you get to keep everything that you're eligible for. Next slide, please. I talked before about the Treasury Guidance, so I won't spend too much on this. They issued what they call an interim final rule, just basically has outlined of what the funds can be used for, what's eligible. They've put out a fact sheet, and they've put out some FAQs. I think it's about 28 FAQs that are put out at this point. They'll probably add to that. So what I would recommend is that you monitor the Treasury Department guidance on ARPA. They do periodically update the FAQs. At some point, they'll be putting out a final rule, and then they'll be putting out some additional guidance on how to apply for the various programs that are going to be out there and what the county is going to be eligible for. So again, as a start, if you don't have a SAM account set up with Treasury, I would recommend you do that. Provide all the information that they require, the DUNS number, and those types of things. It'll make it a lot easier when this funding is finally released. Next slide, please. Eligible use of funds. I'm not going to talk about too much about this. It's going to be for anything that's really COVID related expended. There's going to be some capital projects that are going to be out there. There's going to be able to cover some of the revenue losses. The capital projects in water, sewer, broadband infrastructure. It can't be used to offset tax cuts and things like that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the funds are available through December 31st, 2024. So next slide. I'm not going to talk more about this. I really want to get involved, not for rainy days. So you can just read these at your leisure. It just sort of lists all the types of things they're eligible for. So next slide, please. Reporting requirements. Treasury has established reporting requirements for the CARES Act. I think what's going to happen, they're just going to take those processes that are already in place by Treasury and do it. It's done on a quarterly basis right now. Recipients are required to submit an interim report, quarterly project, kind of similar to what you do with your other federal grants, issuing quarterly reports, in most cases through the state. But the difference is that you're receiving money directly from Treasury. So you're going to have to interact directly with Treasury. You're not going to have the state there as an intermediary on these types of things. And I'll talk more about that later. Okay, so the Omb Guidance, this is what's critical. This is what you need to know. Omb issued a memo, it's M21-20, and this was issued to all federal departments on the administration and financial use of the ARPA funds. So this is the one that's, to ensure financial compliance, to afford taxpayer transparency. They said use 2 CFR to the maximum extent possible. I talked about the SAM registration, the management of payment integrity request. There's a whole section on that if you're interested in reading it. That talks about identifying and preventing duplication of payments, making sure you have adequate internal controls, some of those types of things. So the agencies are going to be a lot more stringent than they have been in the past about monitoring a lot of the activities and where this funding is going to and reporting requirements. So be prepared for that. Emphasis on sub-recipient reporting. There was a section in there that talks about how the auditors, when they go out and are expected to look at how the subrecipients are reporting. So if you are a county and you expect to have, distributions to local governments as a subrecipient, the expectation is that you're going to have to provide some sort of oversight and report back on how those funds are being spent. The auditors are required to review compliance with 2 CFR. That would be federal auditors, that would be A133 auditors, single audit auditors, possibly state auditors if they come in. So this is going to be front and center on their list of requirements is taking a look at the 2 CFR. They're going to be trying to identify recipient noncompliance, and typically that'll be reported in audit reports. And then most of the procurement requirements are in effect. There's a couple that may be waived, geographic preference and minority business enterprise. Under the current rules, if you're not a state, if you're a county, you're not allowed to use geographic preference when you're using dollars. That would mean that if you have a solicitation for proposals and you're giving like 10% bonus points if they live in that area, that's prohibited, but it could be waived. And then you also have to actively try to identify and include minority business enterprises in any type of procurement, and they could be waived too. So I would sort of consult with Treasury on that, but the rest of the procurement provisions will be applicable to this, and I'll get into that in a minute. Next slide. Okay, let me talk about the various oversight agencies and what to expect. Part of the recent legislation, Congress created what they call the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. And this is kind of similar to what I did when I was with the Department of Homeland Security. It's like a special group that's going to oversee the activity. I was a special inspector for Gulf Coast Oversight, where I coordinate all the federal dollars that were going down or oversee, establish programs for fraud, waste, and abuse. There was another one after the ARRA that came out. It was called the RAT Board, the Recovery Accountability Transparency Board. And now this one is called the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. And this is part of the, there's a group of all the federal inspector generals called the Council of Inspector Generals for Integrity and Efficiency. They were appropriated $80 million to provide oversight and reports back to Congress. So I know right now they're collecting information, they're looking at it, but this is going to be a mechanism that they're going to be collecting information from state, local governments on the types of contractors that are being used, the type of grants that are being made. And it's also going to compile audits that are done by the various inspector generals of the different agencies that are involved, including Treasury, DHS, some of those types of things. And they'll be reporting back on a quarterly basis. There's also a special inspector general for pandemic recovery. That's part of the Department of Treasury, and that deals mostly with some of the Small Business Administration loans. So if you have those, you may get some inquiries from them. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, they were appropriated $77 million. So you can expect GAO, which is part of the legislative branch, to be sort of lockstep with some of the federal guys in the executive branch under the PRAC. So there'll be some oversight there too. There's a congressional commission on oversight. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do, whether they're just going to monitor the activities of the other, or whether they're going to commission different reports and those types of things. And then most of the federal Department of Inspector Generals have had increases in their appropriations to deal with some of these types of activities, excuse me. So they will be out there. And then in a lot of cases, the state auditor's office, their equivalent, will be also looking at how some of the funding is spent throughout the state. So there's going to be a lot of people out there looking at these types of things. There's going to be a lot of oversight activities going on. We're dealing with trillions and trillions of dollars between the CARES Act and the ARPA. And from a taxpayer perspective, it's probably a good thing. But as a county, you really need to understand what the rules are. You really need to understand about what to expect if these guys come knocking, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the focus? If you're selected for an audit or part of an audit, what are the areas of focus? Well, certainly, as I said before, they're going to look at the compliance with 2 CFR. They're going to look at the grant award, the terms and conditions, the FAQs, fact sheets, guidance from Treasury, any type of guidance is out there that they can measure compliance. Individual program, they'll look at scope and eligibility, was the fund spent correctly. Risk assessments have to be done, and high risk subrecipients would expect some additional monitoring. There's reporting requirements, quarterly reports, those types of things. They'll look at internal controls because the government auditors have to follow what they call the yellow book, which is generally accepted government auditing standards. And that requires in any type of audit, you actually have to go in and assess internal controls and report on it. They'll be looking at the file documentation is going to be critical, and then compliance with the scope. Was the work done consistent with the scope of the grant? They'll also be looking at duplication of benefits and overlap funding. And this is going to be critical because there's several layers of funding. You got the CARES Act that came in and provided some funding, and you got the Omnibus that provided some additional funding. Now you got the ARPA providing funding, and they got FEMA out there also providing funding. So, and a lot of these types of programs that are out there, especially between the CARES Act and FEMA, are very similar. And so the expectation is that, and FEMA's mantra has always been, we're the provider of last resort. So the questions you may get from FEMA are saying, did you exhaust other sources of funding before you came to FEMA? or did this duplicate that? And then on top of that, there's insurance, with if you guys have any healthcare providers as part of the county. So this is what's really going to be, very, very difficult for a lot of the folks if they don't understand what the big picture. And the other issue dealing with duplication of benefits is that while the counties are getting direct allocations, the states are getting direct allocations, and some of those allocations could be for purposes very similar. For example, the ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Some states are getting funding, and some locals are getting funding. So, understanding who is providing what type of benefit, and and avoiding those duplications is going to be critical. But I've worked in a couple different states right now where some of the counties are handling the ERAP program, for example, and some of the states are doing it. In some cases, I've seen where they're both doing it and not talking. So understanding what is going on with this duplication of benefits overlap with the state programs is going to be critical. There's going to look at procurement requirements. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about procurement because that's really where a lot of folks get in trouble with the various oversight groups. Reporting requirements, and then again, the Treasury maintains administration, GAO, they're going to provide oversight. So there's going to be a lot of different types of auditors coming in, taking a look at these types of things. So next slide. Okay, so common audit findings, inadequate source documentation, that could be, and it all depends on how the audits are set up. They may come in and say, you have 10 projects, we're going to audit 5 of them, we're going to audit 5 top to bottom. And, even if it's an immaterial amount, a lot of times I've seen auditors come in and, just as an example, they'll just say, we couldn't find this item for $100, and they'll make a big deal about it, even if it's eligible. So maintaining adequate source documentation. What I would highly recommend is that you set up separate accounts for all the funding, whether it's CARES Act, whether it's FEMA, try not to commingle, try to keep a good audit trail. Ineligible work performed and claimed. That's pretty obvious. If the work is not consistent with the scope of the grant, they'll report that. Claims of duplication of benefits, I talked about that before. I have another slide coming up on contracting, so I'll save that for later. Improper monitoring, the expectation is that there has to be, if funding is going out, especially to subrecipients, that there has to be some sort of monitoring program in there. And that also includes monitoring contracts that are also let using some of these dollars. Using debarred vendors, there has to be evidence that if you're going to procure something, that you're not using debarred vendors or they're not registered with SAM. Improper vetting of subrecipients, and non-compliance with any applicable guidance. So those are some of the common things that get folks in trouble. Next. Okay, so I want to spend a minute or two talking about procurement, because that's really one of the most heavily scrutinized areas. A lot of the funding they're going to be using is going to, especially on some of the capital projects, procurement is going to be applicable. And the interesting thing about 2 CFR is that it used to be that you would use these most stringent procurement regulations, whether it's the federal, the state, or the local. What 2 CFR did when they came into existence, when they actually changed the rules and said, if you're a state, you follow your own procurement regulations, whether they comply or conform with the federal regulations or not. If you're not a state, if you're a subrecipient, or in the case of ARPA, potentially a direct recipient, you must follow your regulations must conform with the federal acquisition regulations as expended in 2 CFR. So you need to understand what those regulations are. Take a look at your purchasing or your procurement regulations. Just make sure they comply. OMB in their guidance suggesting for economies and efficiencies, the use of intergovernmental buy boards and those types of things. I will caution you that there are a lot of different vendors on those boards, and there, some are national types things. If a vendor comes and says, I'm on this schedule, you can sole source me, the inspector generals and the oversight will probably frown upon that. They would expect you to go out and try to get a better price by getting multiple bids and documenting those bids. So using a buy board is okay, but just make sure that you're trying to go out and get additional bids and looking and evaluating those types of bids, and have evidence to do that. Any contract over $250,000 must have a cost and price analysis. In other words, you must have a pretty good idea what it's going to cost. If you're procuring that, kind of like you're going to rebuild the kitchen, for example, and you have a pretty good idea what your budget's going to be for those types of things. The same thing applies here. You have to have a cost and price analysis, and it has to be documented and maintained in the contract file, because that would probably be one of the first types of things that the auditors will look for when they get in. Micro purchases, different rules apply. You don't have to be as stringent and go out, but there are specific rules that are listed in 2 CFR. So understanding what the thresholds are and what the different rules are. Some you can just, if they're under a certain amount, you can just make a couple phone calls and do the best you can and document it. You can do like micro purchases and some of those types of things. There's different thresholds. Exigent circumstances, we see that sometimes, especially in FEMA after disaster, where you just can't go out and do a full-blown RFP, and you have to get something out quick. So in those types of circumstances, you are allowed to there is some flexibility about getting folks on board, but the expectation is, if there's an ongoing need for it, once the situation has calmed down, then you would go out and do a full-blown a procurement request. But that is something the auditors will look at. During COVID with FEMA, FEMA relaxed those, and they determined that the entire period, and even to this day, is exigent. So there are opportunities if you need somebody quickly to go ahead under FEMA types of things, but I wouldn't expect those under ARPA. So, unless there's something out there that only one provider can have, document it and follow those rules. Don't use debarred contractors. You can use different types of contract. There's time materials. The critical thing with time and materials is make sure there's a cap or not to exceed clause in there. So if it's open-ended, that is something the auditors would take issue with. Fixed price contracts are typically the most favored, where it's like a lump sum or term type contract where that's it. Cost plus percentage of cost are strictly prohibited by federal regulations. It's basically, there's no incentive to control costs. As a matter of fact, the more cost you incur, the higher your percentage is going to be on top of that. So they don't ever use a cost plus percentage of cost contracts. Making sure there's bonding requirements. There's certain provisions that are outlined in 2 CFR that must be included in all contracts if you're using federal dollars. I don't have the site right in front of me, but there is, you must have those. That would be something that the auditors would be asking for. Contractor oversight, making sure that the goods and services that you are requesting are delivered the right way, evidence that somebody is signing off and reviewing, keeping records and documenting anomalies. If you are doing a full-blown audit, a full-blown procurement, the best advice is that if you're doing a set up and establish a evaluation committee to take a look at that, document that type of stuff, have that available, that you actually did the cost and price analysis, but there was a thorough evaluation and vetting of all the contractors too. So these are the types of things that I've seen where a lot of folks get in trouble. So again, and procurements, what I've seen with the auditors is that there's like one little thing that is potentially, not being adhered to, like there's no evidence that you check for debarred vendors. They may question the entire contract, even if it's fair or reasonable, the cost, the work's been done, they may take a look at that and question that. So it's really important when you're dealing with contracts to understand that. Next slide, please. So proper accounting, cost documentation is the key. There are going to be extensive documentation requirements. So it's going to be challenging for some of the smaller jurisdictions that just don't have that experience dealing with the federal types of things. So and typically there's opportunities in the federal funding, if there are incremental costs dealing with this stuff, to go out and hire additional folks, to hire temporary staff, to hire out, external type of assistance to do those types of things. So if it is a increased burden, there are opportunities through the federal grants to pay for some of these additional costs. Next slide. Duplication of benefits. I talked before about the duplication of benefits. I want to talk a bit more, if you're going to commingle funds, use caution. I know there's some CARES Act dollars that may still be out there, either a direct allocation or from the state. For a while, the CARES Act dollars were available to pay the FEMA cost match, but FEMA made it 100%, so that's not going to be there before. And now the ARPA. FEMA and the ARPA must follow 2 CFR. The CARES Act doesn't. So if there's a project where you're using a combination of these types of funding, you may have two sets of rules that are going to be applicable. So, just think through if you're using some of the CARES Act dollars, and they're pretty flexible with potentially using, combining with ARP to do a bigger and better project, because it will get tricky. There'll be different types of, reporting requirements and some of those types of things. So best to keep it separate, but there may be opportunities where you may have to combine that. But, my point is just, if you're going to commingle some of these funds, use caution. And I've seen this before in other types of grant programs, especially with the FEMA grants, where there's a matching requirement, and HUD has their community development block program. And they're allowed to use those types of funds. And there are some differences. And I've seen cases where orders come in and, they may question the entire project because something wasn't complied with on the HUD regulations, and FEMA was fully complied with. So just use caution if there are opportunities to go ahead and combine those funds. Next slide. Okay, the audit process, you'll get notified of the audit. There will be findings. Unfortunately, a lot of the audit reports are public records. The audit reports specific to ARPA will probably go into some sort of a clearinghouse with the PRAC, the Pandemic Recovery Accountability Board, and they will probably publish as part of that, as part of the report to Congress. There'll also be individual reports. You've probably seen a lot of these when they come in and they question things. The problem with the reports is that, you get the negative publicity that goes along with that, even if the reports are, resolved later on, and there's no de-obligations, just being aware of those types of things and the negative publicity that may come along with those. The auditors are going to report the findings, whether it's non-compliance with 2 CFR, whether it's ineligible project costs, whether duplication of benefits, it'll all be spelled out there. And it will be going to, they'll have recommendations and report. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in a lot of the federal grant programs, including FEMA, when the auditors come out and do a FEMA audit, they'll be doing the audit at the subrecipient level. So it could be a county, okay? But when that audit report is issued on that county, the actual audit report is issued to FEMA and to the state, because the state is the recipient of those dollars, and it's really up to the state to be able to work with the subrecipient and resolve those. But ultimately, the state is on the hook for any de-obligations and clawbacks and those types of things. The interesting thing that we're going to see in this case is that there are direct allocations going to the counties. So the interaction between the federal auditors and oversight group will be directly with the county. And then so it'll put the county in kind of a new position where they have to deal directly on federal audits, how to resolve those audit reports and those types of things, because the state isn't a party to these. So, this is going to be new for a lot of counties out there getting these dollars. How are you selected for an audit? A lot of times it's based on volume of, or the amount of the funding that's coming in. Sometimes it's based on, requests coming in from somebody to do an audit because there was unusual activity or something like that. It could be part of a, just a broader sampling. So there's a lot of different ways they can do it. Given the fact that the number of jurisdictions that are getting funding out here, I don't see them doing 100% of all of this. Nevertheless, you will have to provide this information to the agency that you're getting the funding for closeout anyway, and they'll be doing reviews. So even if it's not a federal review from an oversight organization, you'll still be required to have all this documentation. So my advice is assume you're going to be selected for audit. Okay, just assume you're going to be selected for audit. Do everything you're going to do to prepare for an audit, and that'll help a lot easier facilitate your closeout process too. So, I don't know what the percentage is going to be or how they're going to do it, but what I do know with the auditors try to do a representative sample. So they can't say like, we're going to do audit everybody over $100 million, and if you're under $100 million, you're off the hook. They'll do the 100 million, but they'll also do a representative sample of something smaller than that, just to make sure that everybody's, potentially has a chance to be audited. How do you resolve audit findings? I spent a lot of time working with state and local governments on this. In some cases, it's pretty straightforward. The documentation wasn't available, and the IG can't be there the whole time, or the oversight people can't be there the whole time. They report it, and then you have several more weeks to get it. And based on the documentation, it could be some invoices that you have to get from the vendor, some of those types of things provided. And then typically the IG would sit down and go through it, and it will say this is resolved. it's no longer an issue, some of those types of things. So, but there is a process. It's not the end of the world. If you get selected for an audit and you have a lot of big audit findings, there is an audit resolution process that is very iterative. It takes several times to do it. And the de-obligations and clawbacks, I think that's the biggest issue. The Inspector General, for example, at DHS has been, it seems like they're getting paid by the de-obligation. We've seen some significant ones, over $1 billion in some cases, in clawbacks. In the end, I think a lot of these de-obligations and clawbacks have been reduced. Not all of them. There may be opportunity, there may be something there where they have to go back, but there are going to be opportunities to go ahead and do that. But again, to avoid these types of things, understanding that the types of things I talked about earlier in the process, the rules of 2 CFR, the procurement rules, all those types of things will minimize your, the possibility of de-obligations and clawbacks. Next. And then how to comply. This is kind of a summary, and I'll open up some questions. Just follow the appropriate rules, regulations, and policies. I will tell you, though, is that, dealing a lot with the FEMA and the HUD, those are mature policies, procedures, rules that are in place. You pretty much understand where they're coming from. They don't change that much. The newer money, the Treasury, the CARES Act, and the ARPA, those rules are changing. And in some cases, you're making decisions based on one set of rules, and then they issue another set of rules, and what you thought what made sense then didn't make sense. So understanding what those different rules are when they come out, it may make sense to use CARES Act money for something now, but they change the rules, and maybe it's better to apply under FEMA, or maybe it's better to get some funding on ARPA. So having that flexibility within your organization to be able to understand the different pools of money, how best to sort of maximize your ability to get some of those funds and retain them. So really keeping an eye on that. I can't stress more the documentation, document everything, even if it's the decision to do something. Because what'll happen is that the auditors won't be in, next week or next year. They're probably 2 or 3 years down the line. And in a lot of cases, and I've seen this, my own experience, is that people leave, people go away, they don't work there anymore, they get transferred, they get promoted, and you lose the audit trail. So, document what's going on, document, major decisions that are made, put it in the file, like why you choose this vendor or why you chose to go that route, and just have that, with the expectation that maybe 3 or 5 years down the line, it tells the story you wanted to tell. And then closely monitor. What I've recommended is, assign a person, call them the ARPA SAR, whatever you want to do, whatever you want to call them, to work with the different offices, because even within a county, there could be different pots of money. It could be going to education. It could be going to different areas. So, have that one person in the organization that's going to be responsible for understanding and working with the different, different pools of money and different offices that are getting those money is going to be critical. We don't comply, audit findings, I talked about that, de-obligation, clawbacks, de-obligations, stuff like that. Again, the auditors could be that a couple of years down the road. And then, you face the exposure of a financial burden to your organization. And so next slide. Okay, I know I talked a lot, about 40 minutes. I think that's where I was going to be. I went through a lot of things here. I'm hoping it will help understand what the process, I can talk about this stuff all day because I've done it for the last 40 years. I find much more enjoyable working with state, local governments, county governments, to help them understand the issues, to keep the dollars, versus when I was with the Inspector Generals and trying to get the money back. So you can tell I'm passionate about it. Again, I can talk about this all day, but in the interest of time and the ability to get some Q's and A's in here, I'll turn it back over to Eric.
Yeah, Matt, thank you. And you covered a lot, and appreciate that you've got this background in the Inspector General world and in the audits. Just thinking back on when counties and cities are declared for a disaster, there's always those applicant briefings. I don't think there's an answer to this question, but you have an applicant briefing, so everyone kind of knows what the rules are because you're dealing with a single agency. It's almost like you need something like that today, because I don't think a lot of our counties really know what questions to ask at this point, because the funding is new. There's a lot of different sort of pieces on it. But what I wanted to ask you is, can you just talk about some of these initial reporting requirements that counties have to have in. I think there's one in August, maybe September, October, in order to access the money.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about it, because again, these rules are evolving. There's going to be different tranches of funding. They're going to be, I think the important thing is, make sure you're registered in SAM, okay, the federal grants portal, and then answer all the questions and make sure get that account set up first. I think that's the most critical thing to type to do. If you're anticipating having subrecipients, the subrecipients, like if it's a county, is going to give that to a local government or a city or something like that, they would also have to get registered. So start thinking about those types of things. As far as reporting requirements, I think it's going to be similar to the CARES Act reporting requirements, where there'll be and those rules are changing too, but there's periodic reporting. It's interesting, the information that's being collected by Treasury on how the funds are being spent are being collected by their Inspector General's office, which is kind of unusual. Typically, it's like a program person that would collect information. So I don't know if the Inspector General is going to use that to determine, what the looking for anomalies and looking for types of things. They're looking for procurements. Anything over $50,000 has to be reported, some of those types of things. So expect those types of reporting requirements. I don't, again, since this funding is going directly from Treasury to counties, in a lot of cases, it's not going through the state. I would expect that the Treasury Department would have some sort of a, like you said, an applicant briefing or some sort of information. That's just not out there yet. I mean, we got an interim rule and we got some Q's and A's, and that's about it. So more to come on that. But again, the best thing, I think the best thing for counties to do right now is, we know what the applicable rules and regulations and compliance issues are going to be. We know that 2 CFR is going to be applicable. We know that these counties have to abide by that. A lot of things I talked about. So looking at the systems, are the systems set up to account for these types of things separately? Are the procurement procedures conforming with the federal procurement procedures? Are there controls in place to make sure that, for fraud, waste, and abuse, or improper payments and things like that? I think getting ready for when this money hits the door, you're not starting from scratch.
There are a couple questions came in. It says, can ARPA money be used for park improvements or repair? I know there's an infrastructure component that was approved.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? Sorry, Greg.
Yeah, it says, can the ARPA money be used for park improvements or repair?
I don't know. That's not clear yet. I can do some more research and get back to you on that one. I'm not real sure about that one yet. It's just sort of, if it's kind of the rule of thumb reading through the Treasury Guidance is that if it's as a result, economic loss as a result of the pandemic, then those are the types of things that will be eligible, including, the types of things that are specifically in there, some of the, the roads and streets programs and, and some of the capital improvement type projects. But if it can be tied back to an economic loss due to the pandemic, I think, yeah, it potentially could be.
Okay, another question is, do you anticipate the 2 CFR 200 uniform guidance to also apply to broad governmental services as a result of the revenue loss calculation?
Yeah, I would expect that to apply to that. If it's a grant, you have to treat it like a grant. So expect that. It's probably different types of, how you're going to scope that out could be a little bit different, little nuances on that. But the rule of thumb and according to the OMB, use 2 CFR to the full extent practical. So if it's not practical, I think the department will make a decision saying we're not going to apply it for here and there. But it's pretty much they put the hammer down and said you're using 2 CFR for all these dollars.
Next question is, what about using for being the funds, extractor and dryers for fire services to wash bunker gear?
Again, if it's pandemic related, and it shows an economic loss, I have to look at individual situations on that, but they'd have to demonstrate that. That's pretty much a central theme of this funding, is that it has to be, economically suffering because of the pandemic. If you can make a case for it, I'd make a case for it. But again, you have to tie it back.
And Matt, so you know our state really well. I mean, we have small counties, we have medium, large counties. We have, each of those counties have different, capacities to manage a lot of this funding. What sort of management costs would be eligible? and I guess reimbursable if that's part of it, to hire a consultant to come in and help manage the funding.
Yeah, it doesn't spell out specifically what the percentage should be, but there are, in their Qs and As, they do allow for some of those incremental administrative costs. So I know FEMA for subrecipients, local governments is up to 5%. I think that's similar to what HUD is. So, using those parameters, I think up to 5% would be a reasonable amount. Using that, again, it's permitted according to the Qs and As, and there'll probably be some more guidance coming out on that, whether it's a specific percentage or not. But typically, often, especially the ARPA money, where it's going to a lot more folks, and they just don't have the capacity. And even some of the more complex counties and some of the larger cities, it's going to be a strand of them too. So the expectation is that that funding would be available, and it's typically available through federal dollars.
Can you get
So
back?
yes, I would, and again, the one thing you need to think about is that this is one-time funding also. So it's not a continuous type funding. So going out and building a system to track all this stuff may not make sense. Going out and hiring permanent full-time employees may not make sense. It may make sense to bring in some temporary help, contractors and some of those types of things for the support, because eventually 3-4 years from now, the money's going to be spent, and that's going to be the end of it. So going out and investing in a lot of infrastructure to manage these things is probably not a good idea. A lot of counties, maybe some of the bigger ones, probably already have systems in place to track some of the federal grants that are coming in, or the state grants that could be adapted to do these types of things.
So can you put on your audit hat again just for a minute? You focused on procurement quite a bit. And I know that's an issue, but I'm really concerned about this whole issue of duplication of benefits, because you have so much overlapping money. Can you talk about really what folks ought to have in place to make sure that only the duplication doesn't occur, that the funding only goes to that single activity or individual, and just what are some of the guardrails that they can put in place to make sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's probably going to be the biggest challenge to the counties is knowing. And again, if these were just grants going to all 50 states, you have a pretty good sense of what's going to go down to the counties and what the state is doing. A lot of cases, the counties do not have visibility of what the state is doing. And in some cases, if there's larger cities within a county, they may not have visibility on that. So I think the potential duplications is very high. Understanding, try to get information, if there's a state coordinator, or a local, you have to have that dialogue. You have to understand what they're doing. And, I think from a county perspective, if the state is funding something, you need to understand that, because, those funds that you plan to spend on this thing, if the state can provide, could be spent elsewhere. So, I think the counties just really need to understand just what the different funding requirements are, where the funding are coming from, whether it's a state grant, whether it's federal money coming in, whether it's going to the locals, and just kind of work with all those constituents and stakeholders and just try to sort it out. I mean, that's the best way to do it. I don't think there's a list out there, a database of, for rental assistance, who's going to do that, or grants to small businesses and those types of things. It's just, it's kind of scattershot, unfortunately.
And what about if the county has given money to a nonprofit to manage whatever need was out there? Do they have the ability to go and ask for an audit of that nonprofit?
No, I mean, if they're providing a service, so they would treat that as a contract, or similar to a contract. You're paying them a fee to provide this type of service. So basically, they'll audit like any other vendor. They'll take a look at what the invoices are, what the services are, but they're not going to go out to that third party and do an audit of that third party.
Got it. And then you mentioned documentation. I know whenever there's a hurricane, or the big thing that's always reiterated, at least within the first couple of weeks, is document everything that you have out there. But you also mentioned that sometimes that audit trail gets lost over the years, and that was certainly the case that we saw with some of the communities that were subject to some of FEMA's de-obligations. Could you just kind of hit that home again about what counties ought to do? Because there is employee turnover, there is employee transfers. People's memory gets lost on why they did a certain thing. They may have interacted with a vendor or a different federal person that was, they were working with. But can you just kind of hit that again one more time on and make sure that that audit trail doesn't fade away?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. In some cases, it's like a necessary evil. I mean, if decisions are being made, you need to document those. Even, when we do our work for the different clients, you're going to have a rotation of federal people coming through. We've seen it in the FEMA where you have one guy one week and they have a different view on something, and somebody comes in the next week. But, if they come to a decision, document that, even if it's going back to FEMA or the Treasury saying, here's our understanding of the conversations, and have a record of that, even if they don't respond, but you have something on record, because that's the type of stuff, the auditor's going to come in and say, why did you do that? And without that recommend, we did this for these reasons, just sort of stick it in a file, document it, what the trail is going to be. If there's a shift in federal oversight, if somebody else is coming in and they're questioning things, well, you have a document saying this guy did it. I know it's a pain in the neck to do all this stuff, but I find in the long run that if you document all these key decisions, you document why people were selected. I talked about the evaluation process for the procurements. If you can document, any key decisions that were made along the process, or things that, the federal agency told you, because the rules may change a couple years later, just having that in place, having a sort of a chronological history of that, because we saw it all the time when I was doing audits. It's like, 3, 4, 5 years later, people aren't there. They get promoted, they retire, they go elsewhere, and you just lose the trail. And what it's going to result in, you get big gaps that the auditors are going to say, well, we don't understand why you did this, or we're going to question it. So just sort of, putting together that audit trail, understanding why these decisions were made. I'm dealing with a client right now in the state of California that I got 15 different memos from them on something that happened on a fire 3 years ago, because there's so many gaps. They're coming back. So it's just easier to do it real time versus trying to go back and recreate it, because even if they do document it 3 years later, it's going to raise enough red flags with the auditor. So it's a continuous process, but it's a necessary evil.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I think that's bringing us up to the top of the hour, and like I mentioned, I think a lot of our counties aren't even sure which questions to ask at this point. But if they do have questions, they can reach out to you, I suppose.
Sure.
Your email is up there. There was also someone asked if they can get a link to the 2 CFR that you reference. Is that something that you could send over to us, and we can send it out to those?
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, you can do a quick Google search for 2 CFR and it'll pop up under the Omb guidelines. But yeah, I can send you a link for that too. It's a pretty big document. So it's not like a couple pages. It covers a lot of different things on there. Funny thing is, I know people have that thing memorized. I don't, but I know there's different parts of that. But yes, I definitely take a look at that. Those are going to be the main rules you have to apply for, or be applicable to your federal dollars coming in, and those are the things that the auditor is going to look for. So making sure you have a pretty good understanding of just what's included in 2 CFR, so you know what to expect.
All right. Well, thank you. And Matt, while we appreciated your service in the federal government, I'm glad you're on this side and able to assist counties than when you're on the other side. So
yes, much more enjoyable.
Yeah.
The righteous path, right?
So, all right, Matt, thanks for joining us, and hopefully we can bring you back. And this is going to be a long process, several years of implementing these programs. So we'll probably bring you back and answer some more questions. So thank you today.
Not a problem. Thank you, Eric, and thanks for everybody for listening. And hope you all enjoy your long weekend.